the Asfari Institute was set up 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more right now. And the idea was with the start of the Arab uprising and the emergence of a new generation, a new ecosystem of independent, intersectional, feminist, queer civil society in the region, this was an opportunity to rethink social activism, to think about inclusion, to think about intersectionality, and also to think together about what are the needed, the contemporary, the essential research questions that we need to think about, and how do we facilitate the engagement, the dialogue between social justice activists, feminist activists, and feminists, and also social justice scholars. I'm delighted to host you in this series of incredibly important, I think, conversations today. And we will be starting with keynote speeches by two, I'm not sure how to describe you both, but two amazing feminists, two amazing scholars. First, Dr. Maitrayee Mukhopadhyay. Maitrayee is a social anthropologist. She has how many decades of experience in doing gender and development. She's also my feminist mentor. And she is the first senior non-resident fellow at the Asfari Institute. We'll be seeing more of her. We're hoping to turn her into a resident senior fellow very soon. Dr. Mukhopadhyay is going to address an issue of our times, which is basically rethinking gender and development, rethinking critically what has development meant in the last 4 decades? Why are we in such a difficult spot right now? And what is it that we need to rethink? Later, right after, our collaborator, our wonderful friend, Dr. Vivienne Badaan, also a feminist scholar, if I may add. Vivienne has been thinking with us about the whole framing, conceptualization, but also practice of decolonizing knowledge. Vi is also one of the researchers affiliated to the Asfari Institute, and she's been doing some amazing work on feminist organizing in Lebanon, I think. So thank you both for being with us. This is a hybrid event. Both speakers, both inputs are recorded, and we will be making the recordings available, but also we will be trying to make with Dr. Mukhopadhyay and Dr. Badaan, we will be thinking together about how to make their contribution this morning into a think piece, into something that we can discuss further with our colleagues at AUB and also with our students. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Mukhopadhyay. You're welcome. 20 minutes.
I think it's probably better.
Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear?
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, thank you for that glowing introduction. My topic today is rethinking gender and development, innovative. Yes. Sorry, I'm really bad at this, which is simultaneously doing the PowerPoint. So I've asked Carter. Rethinking gender and development. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Asfari Institute and the AUB for inviting me to the opening of the Institute after its renovation. I'd like to thank my friend Lina, who's just walked out of the room, who has been a long-term colleague and friend. Yes. My topic today is rethinking gender and development, the role of civil society. Actually, it's more to think of the kind of work that we here at Asfari should be doing in rethinking gender and development and, yes, rethinking civil society. I would like to focus on 3 issues. The first is the question of global development today, or what we've been groomed in the late 20th century and first 2 decades of the new millennium to think is development. Second, what is gender and development? development, what has been the impact on development of the decades of feminist activism and theorizing, and vice versa. And finally, is the question of the welfare and advancement and the role of people's associations, people's aspirations, the citizens, for whom all this development was actually meant. Where are they in the picture? And in all of this, what intellectual obligations do we bear here at the Asfari Institute, which is devoted to advancing knowledge and practice on citizenship and civil society? Now, many of you will be quite conversant scholars here, conversant with the history and politics of development, but I'm really going to deliberately go over some of the points because I would like to show how development changed and where we are at present, and with it, the whole gender and development, feminism, knowledge and development, all of that. So I call it the collapse of development. Development studies and indeed gender and development as a critique developed in the context of a vision of world development in the 60s to 80s decades that envisaged that the role of the state and the governing institutions would be interventionist, not only restructuring the means of production and economies, but also social relations with the intent of bringing about more equity. Underpinned by neoclassical economic theory on the one hand, and a modernizing theory in sociology on the other, this vision of world development was teleological in that developing countries, which is us, the formerly colonized, was later to develop on the same lines as the West. The aid for development, and this is important to remember, would come from developed nations. So there was a social contract between those who had colonized and those who were colonized, especially the former colonizers, and but the development priorities would be set at a national level and globally at the United Nations, which would do so in agreement of all the countries. And all these factors are very, very important to remember. The way in which the institutions were arranged and the differential power dynamics. As we know, this vision has been gradually but unrelentingly changing in the last decades of the 20th century and has picked up pace in the first decades of this millennium. I see the faces around me, majorities, late 80s, 90s, born or growing up. So it's kind of, I'm taking you back to backwards in order to go forwards. The oil crisis of the 1970s and early 80s actually put paid to a vision of world development, of growth with distribution. We hadn't had that for very long, but we got used to it. 60s to 80s, just about 20 years. Many of the African countries were only decolonized in the 60s. They had poor infrastructure, was still, kind of suffering from all their wealth had been stolen, et cetera, et cetera. All right. The huge debts, and then there was the oil crisis in the 1980s. The huge debts faced by almost all countries, whether they're the West or the South, North or the South, empowered actually now this time globally the international financial institutions. And that's when the shift occurs, and it has never left us, which are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to take charge of development. All borrowers had to undergo a process of structural reorientation and restructuring of their economies, which generally meant cutting down on the public service role of the public, and it was just understood that redistribution uh, uh, was not on the cards anymore, and market services at unaffordable prices would actually do, kind of meet the needs of the public. And we're talking about public goods like health, education, and the like. All borrowers had to undergo a process of structural restructuring of their economies, which generally meant this. And of course, everybody was affected. But of course, who was hardest hit, since they were fledgling countries with little or no infrastructure structures for public provision, it was the developing countries and the newly decolonized countries. In fact, by the end of the 1980s, most countries in Africa were reduced to great poverty by the infamous structural adjustment programs. A small opportunity for renewal and hope for human rights occurred with the publication towards the end of the 80s, I think it's 89, UNICEF's report entitled Structural Adjustment with the Human Face. Sorry, yes, the next one. Yeah, the next one, sorry. I'm completely forgetting you. Maybe I should do my own now. The consequences of withdrawal, destruction of public education services on children, especially in Africa, were well documented in this report. Gender and development research came into its own here by critiquing the model of development, which had led to a crisis of social reproduction, whereby women's work in social reproduction had tried to cope with the absence of services and the non-availability of food to feed their families. Responding to these pressures, the World Bank and IMF changed the harsh aspects of structural adjustment. A consensus was reached, and the new phase of world development was to be good governance. So the 90s era, more or less, was dedicated to the UN trying to win back space. And indeed, landmark UN World Conferences were held, including the Conference on Women in that decade. But as commentators have pointed out, there was a lot of talk of human rights, but little about redistribution. As of course, there was no, in a restructured economy, good governance only meant that the state was an efficient manager of already existing public, and the state could not actually invest in public welfare. So there was no. I had this ridiculous conversation once in New York at of all places, the UNICEF office, and I was talking to the person on gender and development. And she was talking about, they were doing a manual on gender and human rights. And I said, well, that's good. And I was trying to, kind of join the conversation she was having. And then I said, but human rights, its actual implementation requires resources. And she said, no, it doesn't. I said, what? She was from Sweden, had worked in the UN system forever. And I said, really? How do you see that? She said, well, organizing elections. I said, have you ever been to India during an election? 800 million people vote, out the voters list. They live in mountains, remote villages, etc. And a person from the polling, the Electoral Commission has to reach all these places. Are you joking? Do you know what that kind of, what it costs? Okay, so she said, yeah, okay. I said, yes, setting up an electoral system costs. So no, if you want liberal rights, you have to have elections. Okay, that's fine, but you have to pay for it. In fact, with the end of the decade also ended, but there was, it was an end to this redistribution bit. In fact, with the end of that decade, also ended the role of the UN in setting the priorities for development. The UN could take the lead on targets, and they were always efficiency oriented, and actually organized by the OECD. That is all, the richer countries. For example, the MDG and now the SDGs, but only within the contours of an already set neoliberal economic framework. Sorry, I should have done this myself. Okay, so now we come to the new millennium, last 20 years. Developed the new technologies. Actually, what was that's the real dynamics behind this fast economic globalization? It was the new technologies, and it became the tool for neoliberal globalization. It was possible to organize the production of goods and services in a chain distributed throughout the globe. And we saw that in the pandemic, some parts were not available in India because the ships were stuck somewhere else. And another thing was happening in Amsterdam, some shortage in Amsterdam. I mean, it was crazy during the pandemic because there was, this constant fast communication and, was at an end. Rich countries shifted their production to developing countries, reducing their cost of labor and the headache of having to abide by social regulations like trade unions, the right to associate, bargaining, labor bargaining, etc., etc. By the first decade of the 20th century, many parts of the developed world no longer manufactured their own goods. And if they did, like Germany, the big, it did the high-end stuff, okay, for which parts then were outsourced and came from China primarily. They were outsourced to China, basically. China became the manufacturing center of the world. Yes, we've all met these ridiculous situations where you're sitting in India and phoning Lufthansa, and the person who replies is the call center in Bangalore. So everything was outsourced. Not that it actually, except for China, not that it actually benefited in terms of setting up manufacturing units, because if you didn't have an infrastructure and if you didn't control the populations, and I want to come back to this, you didn't get actually the industries outsourced to your country. So Africa just didn't feature in this game. And by the first decade, a lot of it was going to in China. So it was, of course, no longer possible for governments to promote industry and manufacturing, which was a national responsibility of the state in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But this was over in the 90s, and in the new millennium, definitely. In developing countries, this actually meant that people, 2 generations of 1.5 generations are growing up without actually a future, without a life, without a prospects for actually ever earning your living, being educated. Because this, is it any wonder then? The millions of young people deprived of a life take on these dangerous international migrations, risking death to reach what they think are havens, the rich West. And there's another set of problems there. And what is the role of the state? Throughout the 90s, throughout the 90s, the development model promoted was the consolidation of market-led development and the promotion of a state without politics, an administrative state and a civil society comprised of NGOs who were then going to be, holding governments to accountable. For what? A new governance agenda was promoted, entailing the promotion of liberal democracy. I think it's the next one. No. Liberal democracy, and but the state retained its role only authority allowed to the state now was to, as the option of, the only option of pressure or the violence could be exercised by the state, and we have so much law and order states now. But in neoliberal democracies, this has also begun to fray. The state is not the only one responsible for, the authority to exert violence. Look at the United States. We have how many 100 killings a day, and it's all from private sources. It's not the state, punishing somebody else. So I mean, it's hangs by a thread. All promises of liberal democracies have been kind of okay. Then, well, let's come to gender and development. In all these decades, feminists in development grew out of the 1970s advocacy for equal rights, and as well struggles in the academia. The worldwide movement for gender-just development was greatly helped in the decades 75 to the 1990s with the Organization World Conferences of Women and culminating in the Beijing 1995 World Conference on Women, which accepted the discourse of gender and development, not just women's development, little projects here and there, while the rest of the whole, political economy was failing, but that actually the gender was constitutive of other relations, economic relations, and all other relations. This was accepted. This was accepted as policy, global development policy. But what happened was, as gender and development entered policy, the path-breaking research and activism that fueled the surge for change was increasingly contained within the framework of policy guidelines, into a framework of admissible language of policy and the governance of world development. And so it's at a conference in Beijing, at a conference at the IDS Institute of Development Studies, Sussex in 2004. A lot of us who had been involved both in the activism and academia met to think through what had happened. And what we found was that, as Cornwall says, in the book that was published on this, Feminisms in Development, feminist dissatisfaction with gender in its translated forms in policy and practice. I think I've got it here, no? No. Practice coalesced around struggles for interpretive power over the meanings of gender. We had become basically governance feminists, fitting gender into policy imperatives instead of acting to change the direction of politics and policy. We began losing the feminist intent to resist domination, and instead we were acceding to power in our research as well as in our activism. And then came the pandemic. The worldwide crisis unleashed by COVID-19 virus has exposed the deeply flawed models of international development pursued in the last 4 decades. What the pandemic has really exposed is that the crisis, social, political, economic, is not of today's making. It's not a result of the pandemic, but that it has evolved over decades of financial austerity and neoliberal policies in pursuance of a development paradigm that has enriched the rich and impoverished the poor. Let's call a spade a spade. From a perspective, from a feminist perspective, the systematic undermining of public provision of care has deepened the crisis, which under lockdown conditions simply reinforced private provisioning in the domestic arena, most of it borne by women. But this too is a form of generalization that is partial and built on partitioning of private and domestic. Because for most poor women in this world, They work for livelihoods and in care. They work in production and social reproduction, are continuous, and most often cannot be separated into public and domestic. As Kabir suggested in her keynote address in the conference on work and care that was organized here in the Asfari Institute this year, there are forms of intimate care that cannot be entirely outsourced, as for example, a mother's care of an infant. Now, this is a very finicky area for feminists, an assertion which, although remains acutely sensitive among feminists, nevertheless confirms the need for expanding, therefore, reproductive health and rights and choice. And choice seems to be shutting down in many parts of the world, okay, in liberal democracy. And one of the consequences of the deepening crisis of social reproduction has been the worldwide rise of right-wing politics. The politics of hate and division, I think it's the next one. Politics of hate and division, as people lose faith in their functioning institutions and the social fabric can no longer hold together. It was already evident before the pandemic, but has gathered speed since. Electoral politics, and everybody needs to undergo these elections, whether it be Putin or what's happened in Lebanon. Everybody needs to, in order to legitimize that they actually were chosen. Okay, so this electoral politics has become an exercising of legitimizing existing power holders, and many circumstances have become electoral autocracies, basically. It is no longer democratic, nor is it representative. I had to wait for Lina to pick me up at the AUB gate because I didn't know my way here. So while I was waiting, I was in conversation with the security guard. And, for me, had he worked here long enough, blah, blah, so his family, et cetera, et cetera. And then the first thing, without asking, he said to me, is Lebanon's ruin. These politicians, they have stolen us, all our wealth. And, this complete, this just this ordinary man, talking to a complete stranger, explaining the world here and what it's become to me. And this was his first. So we have to reimagine gender development. We cannot let, it is a critical moment because a lot of what we did has become subservient to power and to policy. Whether it's what is it? Gender as being good economics, etc. Is feminist researchers have also contributed to this rhetoric. Okay, so we have to reimagine gender and development. It grew, feminist knowledge and development grew as a critique of the academia. Its future lies in getting back to re-examining the central critique that was forwarded at that time and which remains extraordinarily true. We have to re-examine the relationship of production to social reproduction in the arena not only of social relations and relations between people, but other living forms which we have dismissed so far as the environment. And always considered as inert. It lies in building bridges with alliances with other social movements struggling for change and for democracy in the interrelationship of social movements for justice. Processes of co-production of gender knowledge will redefine the focus on who defines the knowledge, and I think we have more on it later, knowledge and organized knowledge production in a way that allows the multiplicity of voices to be heard and not just one monolithic homogenized version produced in global forums policy forums to which all others have somehow to fit in. Civil and political society. Now, I really actually only want to talk about the Asfari Institute and its relationship to knowledge and what's the work being done here. I want to remind everybody that just as poor governance preceded the pandemic, so did citizen movements for transformation in many parts of the world precede the COVID-19 lockdown and restrictions that characterize our pandemic world. All these restrictions interrupted the movements for transformation, but they refused to go away. And in the window of opportunity in 2020, when there was some lifting of regulations, they were back again. These movements were global, from the US Black Lives Matter to India, with mass movements for citizenship rights and farmers' protests, and to Sudan, where people were struggling for democracy, to Lebanon, the October revolutions, and Iraq, where citizens crave an end to the despotic chaos of the present. Stretching across the world to Chile and Colombia, where people were protesting against the frail economy and corruption and elitist politics. Well, but what are these movements telling us? The protesters and citizens demanding, these are protesters and citizens demanding a new country. A country in which supremacy of the elite has no place, where there is more public investment in social services and community projects, and less on the police and their military-grade weapons. What these non-violent movements across the globe, from Iraq to India to Iraq, to Chile, were telling us that it is the end of the road for politics, as usual, violent, parochial, and cynical politics. We need a new politics that compels us, as Butler says, to rethink who we are as social creatures in the world, what our relations to one another are, and what our relationship to the earth is in all that sustains and supports us. It is in recognition of this that Asfari Institute has an intellectual obligation to build understanding and dynamic interrelationships between movements and research, so that knowledge generated can be a process of co-production and transcreation, can serve the interests of movements and speak truth to power. Transcreation entails that information gathered from diverse sources and ways of knowing is both intelligible and useful to users. Knowledge. It differs from the act of translation, which, while appearing as neutral process, is partly an act of interpretation and is thus invested with power. Transcreation thereby requires equitable access to knowledge production processes, whether in terms of language or terminology, and dismantling barriers of reproduced knowledge hierarchies. And finally, the location of this institute outside of the developed world and its position as one that builds knowledge on citizenship and civil society in a university setting makes for a unique opportunity to interrupt the discourse of development, of citizenship, and of civil society that is modeled on the parochial experiences in a very smart part of the world, namely the West. Okay, I'm sorry I've taken more time. Lots of time?
It's okay. You're good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mochi.
Thank you, Maitrayee. It was never going to be 20 minutes. But thank you for speaking truth to power. Thank you for framing beautifully the mission of the Asfari Institute in the ways in which we are part of that social movement, the ways in which we should be serving social justice movement in the region. And thank you for linking all of this to what is happening globally, because instinct normally is basically to look at ourselves and think that we're the center of the world, and we really are not. So thank you for putting this through. And before moving to Vivienne, I want to welcome our wonderful neighbor, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, Dr. Salma Abou-Habib, thank you for being with us, and our colleagues from the Asfari Foundation, and we expect him, the co-founder of the foundation, to be with us soon. And I hope you stay with us after our next speaker, Vivienne, where we will be joined by our wonderful colleague, Maitrayee from the IDRC in Canada, our friend and our donor, who's going to be bringing the next very exciting conversation. But before that, I want to give the floor to, may I say it again, our wonderful young scholar, feminist scholar, Dr. Vivienne Badaan, one of the students' favorites and one of my favorites as well, to take us through actually a continuation of the conversation that Maitrayee started on the decolonization of knowledge.
I'm going to use this because is it on? Okay, because I like to stand, it makes me less nervous. Especially after going after you, I'm very, very nervous. So I think this helps me ease some of the tension. Thank you all for having me. It was a pleasure to hear you speak in person for the first time. I've been following your work closely and attending everything that Asfari has had that involves you. So it's a great pleasure for me to be speaking here today and to be speaking after you. In my talk, I will be talking a bit about decolonizing knowledge and how we can foster homegrown knowledge and how that could contribute to the decolonial process. I will be focusing on the Arab region in most of my talk because we're trying to think regionally. We're trying to think about how we can forge regional collaboration that generate knowledge that is not only stuck in space in one country, but rather is translational across the Arab world. So to do that, I'll first start by talking about the decoloniality of knowledge. Is it okay to go into full screen? Sorry, just because. All right.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll first start by talking about the decoloniality of knowledge. I'll then zoom in to the Arab region and see how we can, what are the specific struggles to our region and how we can work around them. I'll give some recommendations that my friends and I have been working on for the past year or so. And then I'll focus quite extensively on the role of the Asfari Institute under Lina's leadership in fostering this homegrown knowledge and how that kind of represents what we've been talking about when we say we need locally produced knowledge that is from the region and for the region. So very briefly, I did most of this in a talk in a conference last week here in the same space. So I'm just going to go over it briefly. And I'll position myself as an academic researcher when I'm talking about these issues. And academic knowledge production is colonial by nature in terms of the methods that we use, the theories that we use, and the kind of paradigms that we function within in academic knowledge. And most of this is centered or put forth by global North institutions, journals, and researchers, coming from settings that are quite different from the settings where we are conducting our own research. And colonial powers have historically imposed these ways of knowing and knowledge production that we continue to use and reproduce, even when we're trying to think about how we can indigenize knowledge production. So I made the big argument that knowledge production is colonial, and there are several reasons why we can simply and easily make the conclusion that knowledge production is colonial. The first question that we can ask is who decides what knowledge is produced? And most of the time, the decision-making happens at the level of grants and fund making. Funders mostly come from the global north, they have a certain agenda. There are larger organizations that, we tailor our research to fit according to their metrics. Most knowledge is produced in elite institutions, at least academic knowledge is produced in elite institutions. Those elite institutions are in the global north. They're produced in research centers and research labs that are led by global north researchers, who typically happen to be, white men for the most part of European descent. And the knowledge is produced generally to either, publish or perish, or to, be able to apply to the next grant, get the next fund, or to meet, the donor's needs for knowledge production. So that's, I think, the most disheartening.
I cannot have a full screen because it's on Zoom
It's
also.
okay. It's okay. If there's any squiggly lines under the words decoloniality, because apparently where Microsoft does not recognize the term decoloniality, this is why. Exactly. Talking about hegemony, right? And finally, which knowledge is more valued in academic research? Usually knowledge that ascribes to the scientific methods, at least in the social sciences, the scientific methods put forth by the West, for the West and the rest of the world. Is the kind of knowledge that is more valued. Knowledge that's produced in top-tier journals. Those journals tend to be only accessible to researchers, institutions and so on. Okay, that's the knowledge production problem. But also today I wanted to talk a bit more about the knowledge dissemination problem, which we talked less about. How is knowledge shared and how is it disseminated? And academic knowledge in particular tends to be quite exclusionary and quite insular. How is academic knowledge disseminated? It's mostly disseminated in journal articles that are quite inaccessible. So if you're not within an academic institution that has enough funds to subscribe to those journals, you don't really get to read those papers because they cost, $30, $40 to purchase one PDF, and that's not what most of the world can do. Oftentimes, academic knowledge is disseminated in the English language, which makes it alienating for most of the non-English speaking world, which is most of the global south. There are also publication biases. So when researchers like myself and my colleagues are trying to publish with data that is coming from, an uninteresting place in the world, that's not coming from Stanford or Harvard, we tend to face publication barriers, and we get more questions around our research, our methodologies, and our paradigms than researchers from the global north. So these publication biases disproportionately negatively impact scholars from the global south. Academic knowledge is disseminated in academic conferences, and these conferences tend to be very expensive, and you have to be a member of the association or the organization that is organizing it so that you can actually join. So both of those processes are expensive and exclusive, but also most of them are held in Europe or North America, where people from the global south might have a lot of difficulty traveling there, obtaining visas there. I know personally, as a Palestinian scholar, I've had immense difficulties traveling to conduct give my talks or do research in various conferences, especially across Europe. Academic research contains disciplinary jargon, and we all know how jargon does not help make knowledge accessible. And when we are conducting, when we are disseminating the results of our research, we oftentimes don't think about who participated in generating that research. So our participants never really get access to the knowledge that we produce. This is mostly about academic research, but we can say that similar methods do apply to a lot of the gray literature that's produced by non-academic organizations as well. So I'll move on to the next part of this, which is about decolonizing knowledge by fostering homegrown knowledge. There are some research, so the challenges that I put forth earlier are challenges that are, quite pervasive across the global south. But there are some challenges to producing localized Arab knowledge as well that are specific to the Arab region. The first one is restricted funding and training, especially for graduate students and early career scholars. Many linguistic challenges, including the fact that very little knowledge production in academia is put forth in the Arabic language, which is the language we share across the region. There is, at least within the social sciences, this push for what is called scientific mimicry, which is taking on the scientific tools and methods that are put forth by the West and trying to mimic them because we perceive that these ways of knowledge production are optimal, are the best, are superior to any kind of local means or culturally driven means of knowledge production. And this faces hurdles to indigenous or unique approaches to knowledge production. As I said earlier, there are publication barriers. They're quite extensive for Arabic speakers too, especially when our reviewers and our journal editors write us back saying, "Oh, your grammar needs fixing," There's a lack of associations, conferences, and networks formed internally. I can think of a few exceptions. For example, the Arab Council for the Social Sciences is one that's trying to bring social scientists from the region together. But we still have a lot of work to do in terms of associating at the regional level. We don't have many renowned journals or databases to spread local knowledge among local scholars. And finally, we do, as at least I can say as a social psychologist, we do struggle a bit with participant recruitment. We don't have the easy methods that folks in the global north have to obtain research samples, robust, large research samples to conduct our research. The next thing I want to talk about that is specific to the region, but also I think it does translate across collaborations between North-South collaborations for the most part. First of all, in terms of when we are starting research collaborations, there are very few opportunities for intra-Arab collaborations. You know, especially for early career scholars, we have this preconceived notion that for us to be able to advance our work and advance our research, we need to be collaborating with researchers from big institutions from the north. So we tend to opt for those kinds of research collaborations. And when these research collaborations that are international or multinational happen, they are usually led by global north researchers who reach out to Arab scholars. And eventually down the line, we end up being mere data collectors. We're not involved in creating the methodology, the theoretical frameworks. We just receive everything as is, collect the data, send it back to the global north researchers, and they do their own thing, and we get a publication under our name. We're not involved in the knowledge generation process at all. The worst part is when global north researchers just come into the region, extract information, and leave without any consultation from the bottom up with local scholars. And that's quite problematic because it makes the lens in which they are approaching their work quite voyeuristic and not very culturally responsive. So now that we've laid out the problem, in a recent piece that we wrote that's specific to psychology of the Arab region, we put forth some recommendations as to how we can promote more responsive indigenous Arab knowledge production. And I think this is an excellent segue to my next chunk of my talk, which focuses on how the Asfari Institute is trying to forge or work on these recommendations. We have recommended, of course, enhanced funding in graduate student training. We need local scholars who are able to do their work and their research on the ground in the region. We are quite interested in intra-Arab collaborations with a regional focus, creating a network of scholars and activists and research and knowledge producers from around the region so that our focus is not very tight, but travel wider and more applicable. We really think about diaspora researchers, Arab researchers who work in global north institutions, who have more resources, who have more access to the means of knowledge production, play their role in giving back, contributing, and in forging collaborations with local researchers who are working with in institutions in the region. And finally, any collaborations that we are to do should be participatory, should involve the local researchers as equal knowledge producers, if not the folks who know most about the research that they're conducting. And these collaborations should be politically informed in terms of, you know, if you are conducting research in Palestine, you have to acknowledge the separate colonial context of Palestine. You can't really, for example, frame it as an intractable conflict between, you know, two sides. So just this being politically informed before conducting research and collaborations with the region is crucial. And I do strongly believe that the Asfari Institute in its current form, by the way, I've been at the AUB for 2 years, and you know, it was mid-pandemic when I joined, and it was really hard for me to find my footing in terms of how I'm going to work around things. And then I met Lina, and then I found a home for me almost within the academic institution, where I feel like I've been able to do my best work, and I'll explain how and why next. So the Asfari Institute centers producing knowledge from the region and for the region. So the knowledge production focuses on the work of us local researchers. Many of us are sitting around the room who are currently doing this research with Asfari. The work here focuses more on important and timely issues that are rooted in social justice, The methodologies that the Institute employs are quite culturally grounded. There's a big focus on qualitative research, on research that, doesn't ascribe to the methodological hegemonies of the West. And the most important thing that the knowledge that is produced is actionable and has high impact. The impact might not be immediate or fast. The impact is setting the stage for sustainable action over the long run, policy change, social movements, creating networks of scholars and activists who work together. And most importantly, the work is rooted very firmly in an intersectional feminist lens. Unabashedly, it's quite obvious, and nothing strays away from that compass that is guiding most of our work at the Institute. The second thing that Asfari is doing to kind of foster homegrown knowledge is empowering local researchers like myself and local activists as well. And in contrast to most knowledge production processes across the world, and even in academic institutions, including AUB, the Asfari Institute has been centering the work of young local Arab scholars. And most importantly, although the Asfari is working within academia, within an academic institution, the work of non-academic researchers is always pushed to the forefront because they are more important knowledge producers than us within academia as well. The nice thing is, and I'll talk a bit about the sustainable model of training and mentorship soon as well, is that there's a lot of training that happens for budding researchers, fresh graduates, undergraduate students who receive quite a lot of training in conducting research on the ground and conducting field work. And there's a sense of empowerment of researchers, activists, and other advocates who promote the social justice agenda in Lebanon and in the region more broadly. So, and also we receive some funding from the Asfari to do some cool work that would usually go unfunded otherwise, at least as academic researchers. Like if I send a grant application to a Western funding agency about feminist collective action and organizing in Lebanon, they reject me in a heartbeat. But at least here I can get some funds to pay excellent research assistants to work with me. And I think the nice thing about being in this space is that we tend to practice what we preach here. Although functioning within an academic institution, Asfari Institute really brings the community in throughout, in trainings, workshops, events, occasions of seminars and webinars and so on. There's always a sense of bringing the community in. So the academic institution is no longer insular. It's actually porous. We're forging connections with the community that we want to serve here at AUB. And the Asfari is quite student-centered. So student voices are centered in publication, in events, in roundtables. So there's this hierarchy of, there's the experts and there's the people who are there. We're all co-creating knowledge together in the same space. I think what the Institute is doing that is quite nice is that it's bridging the divide between academia and activism. I know it's your slogan, but truly, there's bridges being created. I've met and made more connections with civil society actors, with activists in my time working within Asfari than I had probably in years before that. So it's really encouraging to see that there's ongoing dialogues and collaborations that are happening between academics and activists, academia and civil society. And I think these connections are crucial for us to be able to generate important and homegrown knowledge. And I mentioned the problems with knowledge dissemination earlier. And I think what Asfari does in terms of knowledge dissemination is make it more equitable and accessible. Knowledge is shared publicly. Publications are available for everybody to read. They're available in English and Arabic. Publications are not only those that are produced by people with PhDs, but rather by people with knowledge and experience about the work that they are doing on the ground. And the work is as accessible and as jargon-free as possible that is produced on the platforms of Asfari, which is crucial considering we can reach many more people that way without producing jargon-laden knowledge. I discussed this very briefly, but Asfari focuses on regional collaborations. Over the past week, I've met people from all around the Arab region, people from countries that, folks from spaces that I haven't visited, but also that I didn't envision being able to meet in one space in one day. So this creation of regional dialogue and regional knowledge production means it's quite important for us to foster homegrown knowledge in the Arab region. And I know that I'm going to put it on for 2 seconds only. But I think this is all made to have 2 seconds, I told you, to happen with the facilitation of a homegrown powerhouse who has been working on the ground for the past 40 years, someone I consider my personal mentor. Lina, you have really pushed forth at the Asfari a model of mentorship that is quite sustainable. You practice horizontal mentorship, you practice sustainable mentorship, and you focus so much on creating community and bringing folks into this community, creating a safe space and bringing folks into it, and empowering everyone around you in the process. And I think this sustainable mentorship model is something that is, will help us be able to create and produce and change and engage with one another continuously. So the ethos that I feel like I've learned from you and from the space that we all care for one another, share knowledge for one another, and create opportunities for one another. And I think that's really important to sustain the creation of homegrown knowledge. And the final thing that I'll close with is that spaces like this help us nurture social movements. When we are bringing people who are working on the ground and people who are working in theory and putting them in the same room to think about feminism, to think about gender equality, to think about progressive social change, we are able to generate really powerful knowledge that could inform activists, educators, and academics alike. And I think this is what's very special about thinking about spaces like this as those that decolonize knowledge, both production and dissemination, and that foster homegrown knowledge. So I won't do my conclusions because I think that was a better conclusion than those. Thank you for listening, and thank you for giving me the space to do that. Just do that. Like 2 hours. You close your eyes for it too.
Vivienne, thank you so much. And I could see how, both your introductory comments, Maitrayee and yours, they're really connected and they really complement each other. So thank you both. You're not done with us, actually. This is just the beginning. We're going to take a break and come back at 11:30. The break is outside. Please come back at 11:30, 11:35, and then we will be handing over the floor to Lina from IDRC, and our next panelists are going to be online. Have a nice break. Come back. Of course, that's the most important thing. And at 11:30. Thank you all.